We've heard rumors that the federal deficit may be as large as $100 billion. We can't get there with the numbers that have been put forward so far, but anything's possible.
When Canada's economy faltered, no one expected the roots of the crisis to lie across the border. The growing budget deficit seemed to be an internal problem, the result of failed tax policy and rising spending. But there is more to it than that. It was not just a coincidence or an accounting error, but the result of political decisions made in Washington several years ago. These decisions permanently changed the trade relationship between the two neighbors, the US and Canada.
Carney has also directed federal departments to find 15% of operational savings over the next 3 years. Desjardins says that works out to $15 billion worth of savings in the first year.
Canada has always prided itself on its stability. A strong banking system, developed industry, and stable social policy, all this has made the country an example of northern stability for many years. But that stability ended when the world entered an era of trade wars, when the slogan "America First" became not just an election promise, but an official economic strategy. Since 2018, the US has gradually introduced tariffs on steel, aluminum, and wood, Canada's key export goods. Billions of dollars in lost revenue have hit not only companies but also the state budget. The government had to rescue industries by providing compensation, subsidies, and support programs. But the more the state spent, the faster the deficit grew.
It's been 32 years since the Blue Jays last won the World Series, and this Desjardins report suggests it's been nearly that long since we've seen the deficits that could come with a federal budget on November 4.
At first, it seemed that these were temporary measures, that after the change of administration in Washington, everything would return to normal. But that did not happen. The consequences of Trumponomics turned out to be deeper than anyone expected. In an attempt to make America great again, a chain reaction was set in motion that weakened its closest ally. Canada lost tens of thousands of jobs in industry, especially in the west of the country. Exports fell, and with them, government revenues. The government increased borrowing to compensate for the drop in tax revenues. In recent years, the country's debt has grown to record levels. Financial analysts talk about a structural deficit, one that cannot be closed without revising the entire economic model.
$20 billion in the second, increasing to $30 billion by 2028. And the scale of planned savings is comparable to Stephen Harper's Deficit Reduction Action Plan.
But if you look closer, the story of Canada's deficit isn't just a story of numbers. It's a story of dependence. It's a story of how a country that's the second largest in the world ended up being economically tied to the decisions of one person, the US president. Economists still argue about whether the deficit was inevitable, or whether it could have been prevented if Ottawa had acted more decisively and earlier. Some blame Canada itself too soft, too diplomatic to engage in open confrontation. Others argue that when it comes to Trump, diplomacy does not work. Today, Canada is living in a new reality. The budget deficit is growing, inflation is putting pressure on consumers, and the economy is still dependent on exports to the US. And although Trump left the White House long ago, his shadow still looms over the Canadian economy. This is a story about how one political movement, one decision, one signature on a document can change the economic balance of an entire continent, and about how Canada is still paying for someone else's slogan "America First."
And to these ends, the United States has announced a series of trade actions. Those began near the start of this year with the so-called IEEPA tariffs against Canada and Mexico based on U.S. concerns about the border and fentanyl trafficking.
In the spring of 2024, alarming figures appeared in Canadian news feeds. The country's budget deficit exceeded 52 billion Canadian dollars, almost twice as much as predicted a year earlier. Economists, accustomed to considering Canada a model of fiscal restraint, began talking about a fiscal shock comparable in scale to the crisis of the early 1990s. For a country that had demonstrated its ability to balance social commitments and moderate spending for decades, this was a wake-up call. The Ministry of Finance justified the increase in spending on infrastructure, green projects, and pandemic recovery, but there was an awkward pause behind the dry explanations. No one wanted to say openly what was being whispered behind the scenes, that the roots of the current crisis lie not in Ottawa, but in Washington, and the name of the man whose decisions once set this chain of events in motion is Donald Trump. At first glance, the connection seems far-fetched. Trump left the White House several years ago, and the Canadian budget is already under pressure from other circumstances. But if we trace the path of the economy, since the late 2010s, it becomes clear that the current deficit is not an accident, but the result of a long-term shift that began precisely when the United States dramatically changed the rules of the game. Protectionist policies, tariffs, the renegotiation of trade agreements, pressure on oil companies, none of this disappeared with Trump's departure. It became a structure within which Canada had to live and adapt, losing stability step by step.
Those were quickly followed by reciprocal tariffs on every U.S. trade partner and very high sectoral tariffs applied globally on strategic industries, including steel, aluminum, autos, and copper.
Canada has always been in a special position, too close to the US to ignore it, and too dependent to resist it. More than 70% of Canadian exports go to the United States. This is not just a trade relationship, it is the lifeblood through which most of the national income flows. Every container of Canadian oil, every shipment of lumber or automobiles corresponds to a flow of dollars returning to the budget. And when this system fails, the consequences are felt everywhere from parliamentary debates to supermarket checkouts. For decades, Canada considered this dependence to be safe. The US was seen not as a risk, but as a guarantee of stability. Canadian governments built their economic strategy on the assumption that the American market would always be open and trade relations predictable. That is why, in the 1990s and 2000s, Ottawa actively reduced tariffs, opened up its resources, and allowed large corporations to link production to American supply chains. It worked until a man who questioned the very idea of free trade appeared in the White House.
In a positive and very important development earlier this month, just a few weeks ago, the United States reaffirmed a core commitment to our free trade agreement, CUSMA, by reinforcing that those Canadian exports to the United States that are compliant with that agreement, that are compliant with CUSMA, will not be subject to U.S. IEEPA tariffs.
Trump made no secret of his irritation with what he called unfair deals. This came as a shock to Canada. In 2018, the US administration announced tariffs on steel and aluminum, precisely the industries where Canadian manufacturers had a competitive advantage. According to official data, Canada supplied more than $12 billion worth of products to the US annually, and the sudden price increase destroyed dozens of contracts. Factories in Hamilton and Regina began laying off workers, exports fell by 30%, and the federal government was forced to allocate emergency subsidies. During those years, what economists called the first crack in the dam appeared in the budget, a small but symbolic deficit that foreshadowed much deeper problems.
In fact, the average U.S. tariff rate on the world has jumped from just over 2% at the end of last year to almost 16%, 8 times higher. 16% currently.
But it wasn't just about tariffs. The change in the logic of international trade was much more dangerous. The US began to revise the terms of NAFTA, the agreement that had linked the economies of the 3 North American countries since 1994. After difficult negotiations, the USMCA was born the same agreement, but with tough amendments that primarily benefited Washington. For Canada, this meant the loss of some export quotas and increased pressure on agriculture. Farmers in Saskatchewan and Alberta complained that the new rules had deprived them of their previous advantages, and exports of dairy products to the US fell by almost a third. To soften the blow, the Canadian government increased support for farmers, energy companies, and metallurgists. These programs appeared to be temporary, but gradually became permanent items of expenditure. Over 10 years, the volume of government subsidies grew by almost 40%. At the same time, export tax revenues fell, as goods that had lost their competitiveness in the US market no longer generated the same profits.
Really build on that relationship, and I think that's why the outcome this week was a positive one. Well, we know that no deal has been struck. We know that negotiations are going ahead in the right direction.
In the Ministry of Finance's reports, all this looked like a set of random factors: the pandemic, inflation, and slowing growth. But economists understood that the fundamental reason was a shift in the balance of relations with the US. Even after Joe Biden came to power, protectionist tendencies did not disappear. The new administration was in no hurry to abolish tariffs, explaining this by the need to protect jobs. Moreover, the Inflation Reduction Act passed in the US stimulated domestic production and drew investment away from Canada. Many companies that had previously located their assembly plants in Ontario moved them south. where tax breaks and cheap electricity made business more profitable. The consequences were tangible. The Canadian dollar weakened, foreign investment fell by 15%, and the trade surplus turned into a deficit. The Bank of Canada's reports increasingly featured phrases such as long-term fiscal risk and instability of budget revenues. For a country accustomed to taking pride in its social programs, healthcare, pensions, benefits, this posed a threat not only to economic stability, but also to political stability.
The United States has also imposed substantial trade actions on the Canadian lumber industry. Now, in recent weeks, the United States has agreed a series of trade deals with a variety of countries. And these deals have several aspects in common. First, baseline tariffs cover a broad range of goods and services that are substantially higher than those U.S. tariffs that existed before.
Many analysts see this as a kind of Trumponomics inertia. Even though Trump himself is no longer in power, the consequences of his policies continue to have an effect. The U.S. strengthened its domestic market, made energy cheaper, restricted imports from Canada, and stimulated its own production. All this has created a new pattern of dependence, in which the Canadian economy has become the junior partner with no say. Disagreements have arisen within Canada. Some economists argued that the country had relied on a single market for too long and had failed to take advantage of opportunities in Europe and Asia. Others believed that the structure of the Canadian economy itself was to blame exports of raw materials, a narrow industrial base, and a high share of government spending. But regardless of their assessments, everyone agreed on one thing: the current deficit is not just a number in a report. It is a symptom of a deep vulnerability. A symbolic moment came during a parliamentary session in early 2024, when the finance minister presented an updated report. The document contained the phrase budgetary stress caused by changes in foreign trade conditions for the first time. There were no direct references or names mentioned, but everyone understood who was being referred to.
And Canada's been tough on the military because they have a very low military cost.
They don't allow our banks. Did you know that? Canada does not allow banks to go in.
Thus, the story of Canada's deficit is a story of how proximity to the world's largest economy can be a challenge rather than a blessing. It is a story of how decisions made in Washington to the applause of the electorate can reverberate in Ottawa, Vancouver, and Montreal. And perhaps the most ironic thing about this story is that Canada, a country known for its caution and pragmatism, has fallen victim to the very thing it has always tried to avoid: dependence on foreign policy. Canadian officials tried not to cause panic at the time. Public statements were filled with confident phrases about temporary difficulties and the need to maintain dialogue. But behind closed doors, the Ministry of Finance was preparing an anti-crisis plan, which used the term trade war for the first time. It wasn't just about tariffs. The US started actively subsidizing its own producers, effectively pushing Canadian companies out of the market. What's more, some states introduced additional fees for transporting northern goods, citing environmental concerns as the reason. As a result, the cost of Canadian exports rose by almost 18% in just 1 year.
As in previous trade disputes, Canada has implemented a series of retaliatory tariffs. Their objectives have been to protect Canadian workers and businesses and to incentivize a negotiated settlement with the United States. Few other countries followed suit.
Mass layoffs began in the industrial belt of Ontario and Quebec. According to estimates by the Manufacturers Association, over 50,000 jobs were lost. But most importantly, trust collapsed. Investors, who for decades had considered Canada a safe haven, began to withdraw capital, fearing the unpredictability of trade relations. The Toronto Stock Exchange Index fell, and the Canadian dollar lost about 8% against the US dollar. Ottawa could not afford a political crisis against the backdrop of economic collapse. The government launched a large-scale support program, subsidies for metallurgists, compensation for farmers, tax breaks for exporters. The total cost of these measures exceeded $20 billion. But instead of stabilizing, the economy began to resemble a patient who was being given ever-increasing doses of painkillers without the cause of the pain being addressed. Industry stayed afloat, but the budget began to rapidly lose stability.
As a result of these developments, the breadth and the depth of the changes in U.S. trade policy have become more fully apparent.
Tariffs on the energy sector were particularly painful. The US consumed up to a third of Canada's oil, and any change in supply rules was immediately felt in Alberta. After the introduction of new transportation and certification regulations, exports fell sharply. The Canadian government was forced to buy shares in pipeline projects to prevent them from going bankrupt and to finance the construction of alternative routes. This cost billions that had previously been allocated to healthcare and social programs. In budget reports, these expenditures were listed as investments in energy independence, but in fact, they were a forced response to external pressure. The situation worsened in 2020 when the US revised its procurement rules for federal projects, effectively banning the use of Canadian materials in the construction of government facilities. For Canada, which supplied construction steel and aluminum structures, this was a blow to the gut. In some provinces, production fell by a quarter, and 2 large factories closed in Regina and Windsor. Local authorities demanded federal government intervention, and Ottawa opened its wallet again. Retraining programs, temporary benefits, and compensation for small businesses began.
Specifically, under the new U.S. approach, countries must now buy access to the world's largest economy through a combination of tariffs, investments, unilateral trade liberalization, and policy changes in their home markets.
Each new intervention increased spending. At first, these measures were explained as concern for jobs, then as the need to maintain social stability. But the longer the confrontation lasted, the clearer it became that the budget was bursting at the seams. Over 4 years, the deficit nearly doubled. They did not dare to raise taxes. The electorate was already irritated, and the government's approval rating was falling. They had to borrow. The national debt approached what economists called a critical level, but it was impossible to stop. Without subsidies, entire industries could collapse in a matter of months. When the administration changed in the US, Ottawa breathed a sigh of relief, but it was too early. The new White House leadership did not cancel the protectionist measures. On the contrary, they took on a new form now under the slogan of green transition. The US began to actively invest in its own production of batteries, electric vehicles, and hydrogen technologies, while Canada found itself in the role of a supplier of raw materials without access to end markets. This was a blow to Canadian businesses because the previous model selling materials to the US and buying back finished products became unprofitable.
This new U.S. trade policy has several motivations: to raise tariff revenues, to protect strategic industries, to encourage foreign investment in the United States, and to change trade and non-trade policy in U.S. partners.
To remain competitive, the Canadian government launched a program to stimulate the green industry. Officially, this was a step into the future, but in essence, it was another form of compensation. In its first year alone, it cost nearly $15 billion, most of which went to large corporations involved in the production of batteries and rare earth elements. These companies created jobs, but they were temporary, and the effect on the budget was questionable. Meanwhile, social tensions were growing. Protest movements against federal wastefulness emerged in the western provinces. People did not understand why billions were being spent on subsidies to corporations while the cost of living continued to rise. Ottawa responded that without these measures, the economy would collapse completely. But in the eyes of the population, this looked like an admission of powerlessness.
Those trade deals with other countries also have limited or no relief from those sectoral tariffs in those strategic industries such as steel and autos. They include substantial commitments by the U.S. trade partners for investments in the United States and significant unilateral trade liberalization measures.
The effect on regional budgets was particularly alarming. Provinces dependent on industrial exports began to lose tax revenue. Municipalities cut back on transportation, education, and healthcare programs. In some cities, such as Thunder Bay and Lethbridge, empty industrial zones appeared, which locals called Trump zones, a sign that it was American policy that caused them. By the end of 2023, the federal budget deficit had reached a level that had previously been considered impossible. A new expression appeared in analysts' reports: compensation spiral. It described a situation in which each new government intervention created an even greater need for the next one. The country, which had long prided itself on its economic discipline, found itself in the position of a dependent player, forced to patch up holes caused by external decisions.
In a positive and very important development earlier this month, just a few weeks ago, the United States reaffirmed a core commitment to our free trade agreement, CUSMA. by reinforcing that those Canadian exports to the United States that are compliant with that agreement, that are compliant with CUSMA, will not be subject to U.S. IEEPA tariffs.
Economists admitted in private conversations that Ottawa had fallen into a trap. Any attempt to cut spending immediately caused a political crisis, because behind every subsidy were real jobs. But continuing the support program threatened to devalue the currency and undermine confidence in government bonds. The government chose a compromise to increase debt in the hope that external conditions would change. However, this did not happen.